energy to talk. I try my best, okay, so that we learn something, I hope. So the paper is drawn with Claudia Olivetti and Pablo Pietrangelo. So it's about, what happened to the hours of work over the last 150 years in the US for men and women, okay? So if before you see the paper, I think most of you will have this picture evolving in your mind. So this is a picture of employment rates of men and women in the US over the last 150 years. So typically people will say, there's an increase in women and there's a fall in men. So therefore there's a gender convergence. And many people have been using data for the post-war period, documented the convergence in the gender employment gap for many advanced economies. Now, but if you have that in mind, then when I show you this picture, it will be quite puzzling. Because so that is more like a macro picture. Many macroeconomists will in this talk about the convergence of gender gap. But then if you talk to development people, then they have this picture in their mind, which is what they typically have in mind, a U shape for women. Okay, so when you talk to development economists, they will say that, well, during the early stage of development, female employment rate actually tend to fall. And it was only later on it started to rise. And this you can do with country fixed effect, you still find that U shape. So this is not new, it's in the development literature. And that sort of make you wonder what is going on in the US, because this period of the US will be much like in that development picture, many African countries will have similar level of GDP per capita or the share of agriculture, for example. So it makes you quite a puzzle. Why is this rising? And when you look across country, it's falling. Okay, so that is the question we try to address. And one of the key things is basically this dotted line. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is in 1940, they changed the definition of employment. And that change is critical. Okay, so what we are trying to do in this paper, we are going to give you a consistent measure. So I'm trying to point out is that first figure is inconsistent because there's a change in the definition of employment. So after we constructed this consistent measure, both in terms of bodies and in terms of hours, I will try to convince you, in fact, for the US, there's also a U shape for women. Okay, the U shape is a bit asymmetric, but it is a U shape. It's not a monotonic rising one. And then for men, it's falling. And then that will be the first part. In fact, this will take 80% of the presentation. Then the remaining 20%, I'm going to give you a very simple economic framework, how to explain the U shape of women and the decline of men and the, and the structure of the economy. Okay. And then, so I'm going to I'm going to be very quick on the literature. Many people here work on gender, which I'm not citing your work. So I'm just going to point out the most closely related. As I mentioned, we are not the first person to talk about U-shape. So this paper about India already tried to hint about the relationship between female employment and development is likely to be U-shape. Now, for the US, Claudia Golden has talked about this. So in one of the chapters she has in a book volume, we constructed the employment rates for 1890. And then she find that in 1890, female employment rate is actually similar to 1930. And from there, she basically sort of indicated there's a U shape. So what we do is we do a longer time series for every 10 years using the census. And we look at both the extensive and intensive margin, okay? And there's a separate literature that just talk about the rise of services can explain the conversion of gender gap for the post-war period in a two-sector model. And then what we argue is once you open up to allow the existence of agriculture, then you can explain the U shape, okay? You're not constrained just to a monotony. So that's about it. And then let me go straight to how do we do that. So what is employment? If you talk to labor economists, macroeconomists, they say, well, there's a standard definition of employment. So basically the ILO definition is if you work and the output is in the GDP, then the input is employment. Okay? Now, you might not get paid, okay? Or you might just get profit out of it. You know, all this, it doesn't matter. We don't care. It's more about the output. So suppose your family has a farm, okay? The farm is owned by the husband, and then you help on the farm. Obviously, the husband is not going to pay you a salary, but you know, it will go into the family income and you will all consume it. And the output of the family farm is in the GDP. Okay. In fact, even if you consume something from the farm, that consumption is in the GDP. Okay, so it's a very clear definition. If the output is in the GDP, input is employment. Now, it is clear, but the measurement, though, is very tricky. Okay, so John Durant has a book which put together over 100 country census, and what he point out is that in practice, different countries do it differently. Okay, some say, oh, you have to do 15 hours in order to be counted, and so it's all different practice. In the case of US, it's not even consistent over time. So before 1940, remember that dotted line I put down? The only way you can count as employed is if you are gainfully employed. And gainful employment basically means you get paid. So that monotonic series I show you for the female employment is actually female pay employment. Okay, because before 1940, in order for these women to be counted as employed, they need to be gainfully employed.
And for lots of things, that's actually what we want to understand.
Yes, for a lot of things, yeah, for many things.
I would say that's the main.
Yeah, that is one. So, but if you are just wanted to say, how is that first picture for the US time series compared to the U-shape in the development literature, then it's hard to say, because in many developing countries, unpaid family worker is actually half of the employment. So now we know why in Africa the employment rate is about 70%, even though the GDP per capita is similar to US in 1870. It's because in the US they only counted the pay employment. But I agree with you. For many things, the pay, you say if you want to say whether you work outside the home, whether you have bargaining power, that could be. But for now, I'm just purely understanding is how does employment evolve over time, especially if I want to take that content to relate it to today's developing country. So that U-shaped picture I show you, a lot of it is unpaid employment. So now, after 1940, the census still adopted this ILO definition, but still not entirely consistent. They still sort of put some restriction into that you have to work certain hour in order to be counted. So this link I will not show you, but this is basically in the book on the historic statistic. Then there's one paragraph which basically say, if a worker work for pay for 1 hour, that worker is counted as employed. Then the same paragraph, the next sentence is say, if the worker is an unpaid family worker, then he or she has to work for 15 hours in order to be counted as employed. So if you think about it, if a woman worked on her own farm, she did 14 hours of work, she's not employed. She go to the neighbor and help for 1 hour and the neighbor pay her, she will be employed. Okay, so that is where we wanted to see that picture. What would it look like if I get a consistent measure? Okay, so the challenge is, precisely before 1940, there's a lot of these workers, just like today's developing country. Half of the employment is unpaid. Okay, so how do we get them? There's a lot of them, but where do we find the information? So, first of all, intuitively, we know there must be a lot of undercounting. There's a book that talk about their social attitude. Really, they are very careful in counting women as employed, more to do with that means they're outside the home, the men lose face, or that kind of thing. But if you look at some basic number, in 1890, 40% of population actually live on the farm. Okay. Now, what the census report, there we have 4 million white married women as well. Census at this point report only 23,000 have an agricultural occupation. Then, 60 years later, 26% of population move out of farm. Now, census report, there's 200,000 agricultural occupation. So this is telling you that it cannot be that the agriculture sector shrink by so much. At this point, the agriculture is about 45%. In this point, the agriculture is less than 10%. So it cannot be like when people move out of farm, suddenly you have many more women who are agricultural workers. So it's telling you that in the early period, there's a lot of undercounting. And similarly, if you look at many books, survey, they will tell you that there's a lot of help from the family member, okay? So the way we get these bodies, I'm going to do it two parts. One part is first, I'm going to get the bodies, then I'm going to give you hours, okay? So let me focus on the body first. The idea of getting the body is, actually, I haven't got that yet. Let me skip this. If you have questions,
I mean, what I do when I look at 120 years of female labor force participation is I say, let me look at everyone outside of agriculture and ask what share of those women who are outside of agriculture work. That certainly gives you a consistent definition. Also,
definitely.
And between the ages of X and Y. So you can compare. I mean, the important thing is to really compare apples with apples, not so much.
So I guess there's two different objectives, as I said.
That's what you're trying to understand.
Exactly. So if I wanted to understand this to the literature on the U shape in development, then the unpaid is quite an important part of it. Yeah, and also like.
Or you can also do it the other way.
Yeah,
you get rid of the unpaid.
Yeah, you could get rid of and only to get paid. I think Vidal in the I said when she looked at this return to skill and things, she only look at pay employment. So maybe I shouldn't skip this slide. Okay. So let me try to say why I think this is important. Because you would say that first you might say that home production is also unpaid. Why do you only care about unpaid market work and not unpaid home production? I'm completely sympathizing with it. If we want to understand welfare and women's contribution to consumption, to utility, etc., we should actually include home production. And that's what people try to do in the extended national account. But suppose we don't look at that, then we still have other things that why you want to know this unpaid work in agriculture. For example, if you want to think about the productivity growth in agriculture, you see, all these workers, they were contributing to the agricultural output, but they were not being measured. So the decline of this worker that is not being measured will tell you that you underestimate the agricultural productivity growth. So that's one example. Okay, so that's what we are trying to do is provide another series for people who want appropriate measure. Okay, so let me just skip that. So how do we do that? The idea really borrow a lot from Stephen Ruggles' book, where he has this picture about how did American family evolve. So you say, first, there's this family enterprise in the 18th century, early 19th century, meaning anyone who can work, because there's no single job that offer a man to earn a salary and raise the family. Those jobs doesn't exist, okay? So the whole family have to all work together. That is basically the idea. So with that idea in mind, then you can basically check the following. If a woman say, I'm not gainfully employed, okay? Then you use the census data and see what did the household head has. If the household head is self-employed in agriculture, then we'll say that, this woman must be helping. Okay, so this is an assumption now. Later on, I'm going to show you, okay? Similarly, if the household head say, I have a bakery, then we say this woman has to work in that bakery. Okay, so that is a very simple assumption, and that will give you an upper bound. Okay, and later on, I'm going to show you some direct evidence that she is really helping. Okay, so once you do that, then this line, which we can call it pay employment, okay, this line will be adjusted because now I get back all the women who was doing market work, but who is not getting paid. So this is the U shape in the body. Okay. Now, The very question now arises, okay, first of all, you might not like my assumption, you say, oh, that's too strong, maybe she really was not doing anything.
Sorry,
Maybe she, yeah.
clarification on the exact assumption. So bakery and agricultural work you add back, but what do you not add
Everything
back?
like that. So as soon as the husband say, or
anything.
whoever household head say that they are self-employed,
And anything.
exactly, then we classify into different sectors, okay? So if you classify into different sector, you basically see most of the unpaid work is in agriculture. Okay, there is some unpaid work in manufacturing and in services, but predominantly is in agriculture. Okay, but then at this point, you look at this figure, you say, well, something doesn't feel quite right because it would then mean in 1870, the employment rate of women is just like in 1970. And then you say, well, but these are very different jobs, okay? Maybe in 1870, they only work for 10 hours on the farm because they have to spend so many hours doing home production. So they don't have that much time, okay? Whereas in 1970, they will mostly have a full-time job as a teacher, as a nurse, and etc. So that might be one concern. So then that means that it might be exaggerating the view. On the other hand, if you think about those who get paid, in 1870, they tend to work 10 hours a day for 6 days a week. Whereas in 1970, they work for already like maybe 40 to 50 hours. And nowadays we do 30 to 40 hours. So that's why the intensity matter, okay? The intensity, if I truly wanted to understand women's and men's involvement in the market sector, I would have to put in this intensity, okay? So that's where we are going to go into is basically to find the hours, okay? Now, for manufacturing hours, it actually has a very detailed data. So the census of manufacturing go down very in detail. So you have a lot of information. We also have some information for service hour. Now, then, for the unpaid hour, we will rely a lot on what will come in later on the time use. Okay, so basically we're going to use a University of California project and the Harvard University one. Now, interestingly, from 1940 onward, because when census changed the definition to follow the ILO, they actually record the hours even if they are unpaid. Okay, so then you have all the hours. So these are the pay hours. Okay, so when we put all the things together, and that is not surprising. We're not the first to document this. People have documented this before. For pay hour, it is falling over time. Yes.
But I thought after 1940, you used to work like 15 hours. They consider as work. So if they do work like 30 hours, then
those are the census definition of if you do unpaid work for 15 hours, then you are counted. But here, these are just pay hour per employee.
It's hard for me to imagine that a grown-up female, didn't do anything at 1800 or 1890.
Well,
Because,
that's the point. Yeah.
There is problem.
So let me come back to the discussion with you in one slide, okay? Yeah, so that's exactly the point. So with that pay hour, we also computed some, wage regression. Maybe for 1890, we have most data. For other, it was a bit, yeah.
Previous slide that was conditional on being full-time or.
Yeah, these are per employed, because I want to find the intensity. Yeah, so these are pay hour per employed.
There must be some part-time, and the surprise is 40 hours, so there must be some part-time workers.
It could be, yeah, it could be, yeah.
Still out, right? Okay, I thought like average growth was more like 30 or so.
Yeah, it could be. So these are from the various resources. Yeah.
So wait, women are working more than men in terms of hours?
No, these are per employed.
Oh, per employee.
Yeah, so just for the intensity.
Okay.
Yeah, just for the intensity. Now, going back to that question, yeah, which is the key thing that we really do, because those previous one, other people have documented a bit, about hours per employee for the pay job.
Yeah.
So what hasn't been really done very carefully is these non-pay hours. Okay, and that precisely go to your point. Now, if you're the government, you look at that first figure I show you. In 1870, only 14% of women are employed. Then you think, what are these 86% of women doing? Can it really be that they don't do any work apart from cleaning up the household and everything?
But does it count also as a domestic work?
That's precisely the difference.
No,
That's how
you're saying that it only counts if it contributes to
it
GDP.
contributes to
And
GDP.
so working at home, like taking care of children, if you employ
It's not.
somebody else will be GDP, but if you do it yourself, it doesn't. contribute
Exactly.
to GDP.
Okay, so there's some philosophical thing here, okay?
I mean.
So there is,
Yeah.
I completely agree with you, and sociology has been since the 1960s saying that we need to count home production because women do much more home production than men. But put that aside, because
Yeah,
the
yeah.
output of the home production is not in the GDP. So home production is like the output is enjoyed by the family. It's not in the market for sale. So it's not in the GDP. So the input to home production is not in employment. It's just a name. It could be a stupid name, but that's the way it is defined. But if the output is in the GDP, which is what I'm talking about here, some of the job get paid, some of the job don't get paid. Okay, so that is the key thing. Now, at this point in time, the government look at it, only 14% of women are in this so-called, employment according to census. So they wonder what they are doing. Okay, so back then there is this Bureau of Home Statistics, just like Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's called Bureau of Home Statistics, and we also have Journal of Home Economics, which is over 100 years old. It's a very interesting journal. You find some recipe in it too. Very nice to read. So, but the Bureau of Home Statistics, they basically go and set up station around the US to do essentially like today's time use study. Ask these, they call homemaker. They don't call them housewife. They call them homemaker. And ask them, what do you do? Okay, during the day. Okay, so that is the key thing.
But from the governmental perspective, it's also important to consider those that are working but they are not paid because you
But
can't.
that's exactly, that's why they ask.
Tax that you're losing income.
Yeah,
tax.
exactly. That's my point. Yeah, so I'll come to that. So that is basically, so this is 1925 kernel acts. They have many. So basically what we do is to collect essentially by hand all the study that is published in journal, in books, etc., and trying to fill up this map. Okay, so this is how much we have found. Okay, that we put it. So what do? They ask them, like today's time you study. For every, slot here, write down what you were doing. And there you will differentiate home production and this unpaid market work. Okay, so that's where we get the hours. Okay, so with this, so this is one example. So this lady, she is feeding the chicken. Now this chicken obviously is for the market. It cannot be just for them to consume at home. Okay, and so therefore her work here is unpaid market hours. Okay, so that is basically, and you can look at the participation margin now. Before I assume 100%. So from all these different books, paper, etc., you can see that most of, over 90%, if their home has a farm, they participate. And sometimes they spend quite some, a lot of hours as well. Okay, so when you put all this together, we get what we call a lower band. So basically the hours spent by homemaker in farm work, okay, so this is our unpaid market work, is about 15 hours in 1920 to 30 and 12 in 1940, 7.5 in 1950. Now, we think of this as a lower band for various reasons, okay? First of all, in order to do that, they need to know how to write. So indeed, what we find is the sample of women who are surveyed is more educated than the national average. And also for them to have time to do it, it's not a peak season, that they're not so busy. Okay, so there's some self-selection there. And what is most interesting is this third point here, because some of these tiny studies are done in town. Some are in rural area. Some are in rural area on the farm. Now, if you compare cooking hour, it's not surprising that cooking hour in town is lower than in rural area because of utility, basic facility. But what is interesting is in the rural area, the hours of cooking for those living on the farm is more than 2 hours more per week. And so what we interpret is they're not just cooking for the family, they're cooking for the worker on their farm as well. Okay, so that's another, and then they're also
Is
larger.
fertility larger and also just, and also our extended family?
It could be, but then I don't know whether on the farm will be larger than,
In the city?
and not in the city, in the rural, so I'm comparing rural area, living on the farm and not in the farm. But it could be, yeah, but so that's why we say lower bound. Another reason is many of them are lodger, okay, they have people living there. So we look at 1880 census, we find that 6 to 10% they are hosting lodger. And that is one adjustment that Claudia Golden made, is about the lodgers. Okay, so that's another reason. Finally, we've recently, this is something that we need to do more, is that we have some more direct evidence that there's a much higher farm hour than what we find. So this is why we treat this free number as lower bound. But then there's an upper bound. So if you remember, I told you that from 1940 onward, census actually report these hours. So we know exactly how many hours unpaid worker do. And as it turned out, the hours for the unpaid worker is almost 90% of those who get paid. Now, this is extremely high. That's why we think of it as an upper bound, okay? Because if you think of the intensity of home production, if they also do 90% of the pay work and agricultural work they do, they will not be able to have any time to rest. Okay, so that's why we think of it as an upper bound. So now what I do is I take the body, I compute it in the first figure, I multiply by hours per employee, hours per paid employee, and hours per unpaid employee. And then I generate this range, the lower bound and the upper bound. The key message for you to believe us is this is not monotonic increasing. Okay, this is more like a U than a monotonic bound. Okay, so this is the total employment. Okay, so that is for different purpose depending on the user. What do they want to use the series for? And most of this change is due to the agriculture. Okay, so that is basically then we also report the home production, which is quite a lot of hours, but this is no innovation here. Valerie Ramey has also done something, so I will not spend much time. How much time do I have?
Roughly 10, yeah.
10.
That's
10. Okay, so I will not spend much on that. So let me just summarize. So employment, remember, is if the output is in the GDP, input is the employment. And what we find is, like in the development literature, there's a U shape for women, okay? And then the man is falling throughout. There's a gender convergence in home hour, and the wage ratio was essentially constant until about 1970. So now let me spend my last 9 minutes just to give you an economic mechanism, okay? So what we have in mind is basically, let's take a model of these, we see agriculture play an important role, okay? So we say, let's take the most standard.
Can I just say one thing? I think the point you're making is important because a lot of people have interpreted the U, in my opinion, quite wrongly, saying, oh, as people get wealthier, first they go through a phase where the women, they don't want the women to work outside the home. But that's not at all what's happening. It's really from agriculture.
Exactly. Yeah, that income, in fact, people, so my interpretation of income effect is basically the income effect on the agriculture. Exactly. Thank you.
No, I just think it's an important
Thank you very
point.
much. Yeah. So yeah, that maybe I should make that point very clear in the paper. So what as you can see, the most of the decline of the U is agriculture. So you really need a model of structural transformation. So I'm not making any innovation here. The structural transformation mechanism is very standard. So you have two effects, so-called the Balmer effect, which basically say you want good food and good clothes. and good services. So if the agriculture sector is growing faster in terms of productivity, then you have to put resources into the service sector. Okay, so that is so-called the relative price effect. Then there's a second effect, which is called the Engels curve, basically saying that, oh, services is a luxury good and agriculture is an inferior good. So when people get richer, they spend more on services. So these two are the standard mechanism for structural transformation. Okay, so we're not innovating that, but we're going to say that, okay, so this will be explained by productivity growth. What our key thing is saying that, well, but there's a difference in terms of female intensity. For whatever reason, okay, what we say perceived comparative advantage. People think women are better in doing services. Then you will have an implication for the gender dimension. So I'm going to skip most of this equation because I have very little time. So I'm going to explain the model in a picture, okay? So imagine the following. As a consumer, you like agriculture, manufacturing, and services, plus leisure, okay? So there's a leisure there. So these are all the allocation of non-leisure time. But how do you produce this good? You produce agriculture in the market, manufacturing in the market, but you produce services by doing home production. So this is the real home production. You cook for your family, or you buy food from a restaurant. Okay, so this is the important thing. Okay, there's two ways you produce services. You either do it yourself or you outsource it. So it's like what Raquel said. If you outsource it, it becomes employment. If you do it yourself, it is not employment. And that is critical, okay, for the U shape. So then what happened now? Now you have these forces coming in, okay? In 1870, this is gigantic, okay? This is like 50% of the employment. And productivity growth in agriculture is higher than in services. So that started the structural transformation process. You now can produce a lot of food, but you also want better services. So you have to shift some time into producing services. But there's two ways of producing services. So some of the time will have to go into home production. Now this related to a very famous thing called the Cohen's paradox. Joe Mokia wrote about it. So basically the paradox is saying, oh, look, in the early 1930s, etc., there's a diffusion of household durable, and there's electricity, there's water. Why is the mother still spending so many hours in doing home production? So that's the title of Joe Mokia's paper, Why is there more work for mother? And what he say is there's two reasons. So first is the development of the germ theory. So people know being clean is important. Second is the nutrition theory. People know that it's good to eat good food. So instead of cleaning your bed every 3 months, you might want to wash it more now with all these things coming in. Instead of only having Sunday roast, have cold meal the rest of the week, you might now cook better food. So that's why the home production hour for the homemaker didn't fall very much, despite all this. What for, as Raquel mentioned earlier on, is a higher health. So the washing machine replaced all those servants they used to have. But the mother herself is still doing so much, okay? So that is one thing. So the decline of the employment in our model will be coming from both the increase in home production and increase in leisure. Why did leisure increase? Well, because if you think of agriculture as an inferior good compared to leisure, as you get richer, you will want to have a bit more leisure. So that would be the traditional income effect. It has a bite there, but the majority where the theory is predicting is through the agriculture into the services. Okay, so do I have 2 minutes to show you some?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, so then I would skip on, but I should tell you the framework, the quantitative.
You have 4 minutes actually, and I have a question.
Okay.
Picking up,
It's okay, it's gonna take the 2 minutes.
The extra time.
but just in terms of what you're exploring, you're saying that agriculture is sort of inferior goods.
Yeah, so there's two.
Or
in
than
the complementarity.
But the question is, at the same time, you might have a sort of industrialization which brings new goods onto the market, which makes it actually more valuable to earn money, a sort of industrious revolution type thing. You don't see that at all as
Well,
happening in
it's
that
not that
sense.
we don't see that, we take a very simplified view, let's put it that way. So I would think of these as maybe the luxurious part of these other goods, if you think of it like that. Whereas food in agriculture is this sort of inferior tradition. But in the model, I don't introduce new goods. So I just have agriculture manufacturing.
It's forgetting the mud for
Yeah, but
intuitively.
intuitively, yeah, you could think of it like that. So let me tell you how we are going to, so I show you the data, which is U-shape. I show you a qualitative model where the theory predict a U-shape. But the question is, how much of the U the theory predict? You know, whether it's a decline by 1 hour versus decline by 20 hours, right? So that's why we go into the quantitative illustration just to show you. If I took the most conservative, mostly used parameter in the literature, what does the model generate? Do we get a, you know, reasonable U shape? Okay, that's the question. And at the same time, so my challenge here is, I want to get the U shape for women, the decline for men, and the structural transformation, meaning the change in the sectorial hour. So I want to get gender-specific hour, sectorial-specific hour, and in fact now with the referee, we're adding the aggregate hour, which I don't have a picture for you, but I can show you is quite encouraging, okay? So it's one model for 3 things, okay? But I'm only showing you 2 things today. So, but how do I do that? The theory predicts structural transformation and marketization. So marketization is what I mean, within services, these 2 are good substitute. You know, it's not perfect, okay? Your home cooked food may be better than restaurant food, but if it's so cheap to eat out, you couldn't take the hassle of cooking. So their elasticity of substitution is bigger than 1. But across different goods, the elasticity is less than 1.
Are you saying the wages as exogenous?
The wages will be endogenous.
The wages are gonna be, and the price of services is also.
Everything is, yeah, but I will have one exogenous, which is related to your work, related on gender. And I'm going to, not culture, I'm going to mention that. So that is what the model predict, okay? Remember that picture I showed you of the model? These 2 forces today together give you a U shape. But there are so many other things going on. As I said in the beginning, there's so many people here working on gender. So how do I incorporate them? I'm going to group them all into an exogenous parameter. Now, where does this parameter come from? This parameter comes from the production function, okay? So in all my production function, it will be a CES between female labor and male labor. But there's a coefficient in front of female labor, okay? Previously, I say this is a perceived comparative advantage, okay? So what I'm going to do now is to treat this as exogenous, not explained by my model. And then with that, you derive this wage where, you know, Raquel was asking, oh, the endogenous wage is simply the marginal rate of substitution equal to the wage ratio. So therefore, if I observe wage ratio, I observe hour ratio, I infer this parameter. This is what I mean by exogenous. Okay, so I'm going to infer this exogenous parameter, and then I'm going to say this parameter capture everything we don't do. It could be culture change in the law, where, you know, Martina mentioned before, culture change that Raquel have done before, or technology change. Maybe there's more gender, you know, bias technical change. We don't know, okay? I'm going to just take it from the data. So what does it look like from the data? This 3 color line is the implied side. And it's sort of consistent with people's view that there's a big change to a more gender, female, you know, positive to a woman's labor after the 1970s. It could be the law, it could be culture. We don't know here, we take as exogenous. Then there's a 3rd force, which turned out to be very surprising for us, which is the population ratio. Female to male population ratio. We thought it should be just around 1. But there's a big jump from 1910 to 1960. And that turned out to depress the equilibrium gender wage ratio.
Is that, I mean, is there an influx of men? Is that what you're saying?
We are just looking at the 18 to 65 population. So this is female to male, so it's an influx of women.
There's an influx of.
So some people tell us it could be men die from the war. Some say maybe more immigrant destiny. We don't know, but this is just the data. But it turns out that this is very important because that is what explains the gender wage ratio is almost flat throughout this period. Okay, so I'm so sorry. I know I'm out of time, but I really need to show the result, right?
Is this just exact the working age or it's?
18 to 65. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
So we're not doing anything. We just take the data from census and plot it. But we want it to be in the model because they affect the gender wage ratio. So this is the all three forces together. Our forces of structural transformation and marketization, the exogenous gender specific demand shift, the gender population shift, all three together let us explain both, sectorial hours and gender hour. Now let's do a decomposition, which is important. So what it turned out is our forces is the only one that can explain the decline in the female employment hour because there's no deterioration of gender demand shift or the population. But after 1970, our mechanism can explain only about 20 to 30%. A lot of it is the other literature about gender change and etc. And for men, also the decline is very important due to the decline in agriculture, which is the point you made earlier on. The agriculture really is the key. Now on wages, as I mentioned, if you don't take this gender-specific population, okay, if you don't take it, you should be getting rising wage ratio. So it's the gender-specific population that put a downward pressure on the wage. As a result, in the data, you see a completely flat wages. Okay, I absolutely have no time, right?
You're minus a few minutes.
Minus 7. So then I wouldn't say, but I just wanted to add that.
Are you the first people who made, notice this gender ratio changing over?
Yeah, even Claudia says she hasn't never seen it because, but it's just the data. We didn't. I think it's a paper for you guys to write because I presented in the International History Macro Seminar.
Yeah.
The series that is online.
Yeah.
And there was all historian and they went and double checked. They said, no, this cannot be true. So they went and checked and they said, oh, it is true. So I don't know where it come from because it's huge.
Sorry, what year does it change?
From 1910 to 1910 to 1970.
Amazing.
Yeah, you see how much from 0.95 to 1.15. That is huge.
That's huge.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so I want to just say why history is important.
You're me.
I think we all agree.
The reason is because many of today's developing countries, they're going through this phase. Like if you take China and India, 40% of the world population, very amazing economic growth. Women are getting educated, but when you look at their employment rate, it's falling. Okay? And so we were hoping that to show that there could be a U-turn. If we manage to solve the problem between home production and market production. So in many places, it could be the culture, like what you said, they were not allowed to go outside the home. So being employed in a family business actually is good because you don't show your face to the public.
Yeah.
But once those family business is replaced by bigger scale market production, then the only way you stay employed is to travel out. But if you cannot travel out, then your employment decline. So that's why, and someone mentioned taxation before, and that's why government should care, because if you manage to outsource the home production, it will increase the tax base. I'm really sorry, but yeah.
Great, thank you.